The morning sun washed over my property as I stepped onto my back porch, coffee in hand, admiring the gleaming Robinson R-44 helicopter that sat proudly on its landing pad. That machine represented everything I had worked for: 22 years of military service, countless missions flown in combat zones, and now my well-earned retirement. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour, with only the occasional jogger passing by my corner lot with its white picket fence. Most would wave or nod appreciatively at the helicopter. Some would even stop to chat, curious about the unusual backyard feature. I never minded explaining the aircraft specifications or sharing stories from my flying days. That helicopter was not just transportation, it was a part of my identity. My transition to civilian life had been smoother than most. After retiring from the Army as a helicopter pilot with the rank of lieutenant colonel, I had purchased this home in Oak Ridge Estates specifically because its spacious backyard could legally accommodate my pride and joy. A civilian helicopter I had saved years to afford. Before making the purchase, I had meticulously researched local ordinances, FAA regulations, and even consulted with the previous HOA board to ensure everything was above board. I received written confirmation that my helicopter storage and occasional flights were perfectly permissible under the existing covenants. The neighbors seemed to appreciate having a former military pilot in their midst, especially when I offered free aerial photography for community events or helped search for lost pets from above. The previous HOA president, an affable retired judge named Richard, had even featured my helicopter in the community newsletter as a unique neighborhood asset. Children would often gather at my fence line on weekends, hopping for a glimpse of me performing maintenance checks or preparing for a flight. I would sometimes let them sit in the cockpit, explaining the controls and instruments while their parents took photos. These were good days, peaceful days in a community that felt like the perfect place to enjoy my retirement. My home was my sanctuary, a 4-bedroom colonial with a workshop where I could tinker with mechanical projects, and a study lined with aviation books and memorabilia from my military career. The walls displayed my service medals alongside framed photographs of aircraft I had flown in various parts of the world. Each morning, I would wake up grateful for this life I had built, for the quiet neighborhood and the respectful neighbors who had become friends over the past 3 years. Everything changed when the annual HOA elections brought in a new board, headed by Victoria Harrington, a stern-faced woman who had moved to our community from an exclusive gated development across town. Her campaign had focused on elevating property values and enforcing standards befitting our prestigious community, phrases that should have raised red flags, but most homeowners, including myself, had paid little attention to HOA politics. That indifference would prove costly. The first sign of trouble arrived in my mailbox 6 weeks after Victoria took office. A certified letter with the HOA letterhead, stamped with urgent compliance notice in bold red letters. My heart sank as I read that an unspecified violation needed immediate remediation. The letter directed me to contact the HOA office to discuss the matter, but provided no details about the nature of the supposed infraction. As I stood in my driveway, rereading the vague yet threatening letter, my neighbor Frank approached, his expression concerned. "Got one too, huh?" he asked, holding up an identical envelope. "Victoria is on a rampage. Half the neighborhood has received these. Mine says my garden gnomes are non-conforming lawn ornaments that must be removed within 72 hours or I will face daily fines." I shook my head in disbelief. Mine does not even specify what the violation is, just that I need to contact them immediately. Frank leaned closer, lowering his voice despite there being no one else around. Watch yourself with Victoria. She has been targeting anyone who stands out in any way. And your helicopter. He glanced meaningfully toward my backyard. Well, let us just say she has mentioned it several times at the coffee shop and not favorably. A sense of unease settled over me as I thanked Frank for the warning. That afternoon, I called the HOA office and scheduled a meeting for the following day. That night, I gathered all my documentation, property surveys, the written approval from the previous board, FAA certificates, and local ordinance confirmations. If Victoria wanted to discuss my helicopter, I would be thoroughly prepared to defend my rights. The HOA office occupied a small room in our community clubhouse, a space that had once felt welcoming, but now seemed somehow hostile as I approached the door precisely at my appointed time. Victoria sat behind a desk that appeared too large for the room, flanked by two other board members, Dennis, a retired accountant who avoided eye contact, and Meredith, a real estate agent who offered me a sympathetic smile as I entered. "Colonel Peterson," Victoria began, her voice carrying the artificial sweetness of someone who had practiced sounding pleasant. "Thank you for coming so promptly. Please have a seat." I settled into the chair across from her desk, placing my folder of documents on my lap. "I received your notice about a violation, but there were no specifics included. I am hoping you can clarify the issue so we can resolve it quickly." Victoria's smile tightened as she slid a thick binder across the desk and opened it to a bookmarked page. "The violation, Colonel, is quite serious. According to Covenant 7, Section 12, Paragraph C of our HOA bylaws, no unauthorized vehicles may be stored in residential backyards." She tapped the page with a perfectly manicured fingernail. "Your aircraft clearly falls under this provision." I maintained my composure, though I could feel my military bearing kicking in, my spine straightening. "With all due respect, Ms. Harrington, a helicopter is not classified as a vehicle under FAA regulations or local ordinances. It is an aircraft, and as such, falls under federal aviation jurisdiction." "Additionally," I continued, opening my folder and withdrawing the letter from the previous board, "I have written confirmation from the HOA dated prior to my purchase of the property, explicitly stating that my helicopter storage and operation are permitted." Victoria barely glanced at the document I placed before her. "The previous board was lax in enforcement. We are correcting those oversights. The intent of the covenant is clear. Backyards are not storage facilities for oversized transportation devices." "Furthermore," I continued, undeterred, "FAA regulations supersede HOA covenants when it comes to aircraft. I have all necessary permits and authorizations." I laid out my FAA registration, my pilot's license, and the local municipal approvals one by one on her desk. Dennis finally spoke up, his voice hesitant. "He does seem to have all the proper documentation, Victoria. Perhaps we should consult our attorney before pursuing this further." Victoria shot him a look that could have frozen lava. "The board has discretion in interpreting our covenants, Dennis, and I interpret this one to prohibit helicopters." She turned back to me. "Colonel Peterson, while we appreciate your military service, rules are rules. The helicopter must be removed from your property within 30 days, or you will face fines of $100 per day." Meredith cleared her throat. "Perhaps we could grant a special exception. Many residents have mentioned how they enjoy seeing the helicopter, and Colonel Peterson has been very generous with offering aerial photography for community events." "Exceptions undermine the entire covenant system," Victoria replied sharply. "If we make one, everyone will expect special treatment." I kept my voice level, drawing on decades of military discipline. I understand the importance of rules, Ms. Harrington. However, this is not a request for special treatment. This is about respecting legal hierarchies. Federal aviation law supersedes HOA covenants, and I have operated completely within those laws. Additionally, I have relied on the written approval from the previous board, creating an estoppel situation that would likely not hold up well in civil court. I did not miss the flicker of uncertainty that crossed Victoria's face at the mention of legal proceedings. She quickly masked it with a dismissive wave. Our legal counsel will be in touch with you, Colonel. Until then, consider this meeting your formal notice. 30 days to relocate your helicopter or fines will commence. As I gathered my documents, Meredith caught my eye and gave me a subtle nod that seemed to communicate both apology and warning. I thanked them for their time and exited the office, my mind already working through next steps. Outside the clubhouse, I encountered 3 neighbors waiting anxiously, Frank among them, alongside Linda from across the street and Eduardo from the corner house. "How did it go?" Frank asked quietly. "Not well," I admitted. "Victoria seems determined to force me to remove my helicopter, despite all legal documentation proving I am within my rights." Linda shook her head. "She is on a power trip. She fined me $200 because my holiday decorations stayed up 3 days beyond her arbitrary deadline, a deadline that was not even in the original covenants." Eduardo stepped closer. "She threatened to put a lien on my house because my fence is apparently 2 inches taller than regulation. My fence has been the same height for 12 years, and now suddenly it is a violation." That conversation was the beginning of what I would come to call my resistance network. Neighbors who had also experienced Victoria's overreach and were quietly supporting each other. Over the next 2 weeks, they kept me informed of board activities while I consulted with an attorney specializing in HOA disputes. Meanwhile, despite my attorney's strongly worded letter explaining the legal precedents of FAA regulations, warning notices began appearing on my door, first weekly, then every other day, and finally, a bright orange final notice that threatened enforcement action if my helicopter was not removed within 48 hours. My calls to the HOA office went straight to voicemail. My emails received automated responses. Victoria was deliberately avoiding communication while the clock ticked down. My attorney advised that any actual enforcement would require a court order, which they had not sought, so I should document everything but not panic. I installed additional security cameras covering my backyard and the helicopter, just to be safe. That Friday, I left for a long-planned weekend visit to my brother's family 3 states away. Before departing, I checked all security systems and asked Frank to keep an eye on my property. "If anything happens, call me immediately," I instructed him. Frank promised to be vigilant, though neither of us truly believed Victoria would take direct action without legal backing. We were wronged. Sunday afternoon, as I was driving back into town, my phone erupted with notifications. Multiple security alerts, 6 missed calls from Frank, and a text message that simply read, "They took it. Call me now." My heart hammering against my ribs, I pulled into the nearest gas station and called Frank. His voice was tight with anger as he answered. "They came with a towing company this morning. Victoria Dennis and that contractor who sits on the board, Tom something. They broke the lock on your gate. I tried to stop them, started recording with my phone, told them they had no legal right, but Victoria waived some document she claimed was authorization. The towing company hitched your helicopter to their flatbed and drove off. I called the police, but they said it was a civil matter between you and the HOA. The world seemed to tilt beneath me. My helicopter, worth nearly $500,000, had been essentially stolen from my property. I thanked Frank for trying to intervene and told him I would be home within the hour. As I drove, I called my attorney's emergency line, leaving a detailed message about what had transpired. Then I checked my security camera footage remotely. The video confirmed everything Frank had reported. At 9:17 a.m., a large flatbed tow truck had entered my driveway. Victoria could be clearly seen directing operations as two men cut the padlock on my gate. Dennis stood off to the side, looking distinctly uncomfortable, occasionally checking up and down the street as if worried about being observed. The footage showed Frank approaching, phone raised, as Victoria thrust a paper toward him. Though the audio was not clear enough to catch every word, Victoria's voice carried phrases like legal authorization and persistent violation. The workers attached a winch to my helicopter's skids and carefully pulled it onto the flatbed. The entire operation took less than 30 minutes. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I found not only Frank waiting but half a dozen neighbors, all wearing expressions of disbelief and outrage. Linda handed me a cup of coffee as I stepped from my car. "This is beyond the pale," she said, "even for Victoria." My backyard gate hung awkwardly on broken hinges. On the landing pad where my helicopter should have been, someone had placed a large sign reading, "Violation REMEDIATED by order of OAKRIDGESDATES HOA." My hands trembled with a mixture of fury and dismay as I surveyed the scene. "Where would they take it?" I asked, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "Valley Impound," Eduardo answered. "My cousin works near there and saw them bringing it in. He recognized it as yours and texted me." I thanked them all for their support and went inside to make calls. First to Valley Impound, who confirmed they had my helicopter in their special vehicle storage area. The lot manager sounded apologetic as he explained the daily storage fee, $500, given the size and value of the vehicle. When I demanded to know by what legal authority they had accepted my aircraft, he explained that the towing company had presented documentation that appeared legitimate. "Sir, I just want you to know that this does not feel right to me," he added in a lowered voice. "I have never impounded an aircraft before, but the paperwork had stamps and signatures, and my boss told me to accept it. If you have documentation proving ownership, you can come claim it, though there will be fees due." Next, I called an attorney friend who specialized in aviation law. Her response was immediate and emphatic. "This is completely illegal. The HOA has no jurisdiction over aircraft. Even with a court order, which I doubt they have, the proper procedure would involve the FAA and federal marshals, not a local towing company. This is theft, pure and simple." Armed with this confirmation, I called the police again and requested to file a theft report. The officer who took my call seemed uncertain how to categorize the incident, but agreed to send a patrol car. When two officers arrived 30 minutes later, they listened to my explanation and examined my documentation, but ultimately maintained their position that this was a civil dispute. "Sir, we understand your frustration, but the HOA is claiming they had authority to remove the helicopter under their covenants. This is something that needs to be resolved in civil court," the older officer explained. "So if I break into Victoria Harrington's garage tonight and tow away her Mercedes, claiming she violated some rule I just made up, that would also be a civil matter?" I asked, my patience wearing thin. The younger officer had the decency to look uncomfortable. "It is not exactly the same situation, sir." "It is exactly the same situation," I countered. Except my helicopter is worth considerably more than her Mercedes. They promised to document the incident, but maintained that they could not classify it as theft given the HOA's involvement. As they were leaving, Frank approached me with a community newsletter that had been distributed that morning. "You need to see this," he said grimly. Inside was an announcement for an emergency community meeting, scheduled for Wednesday evening at the clubhouse. The agenda included discussion and vote on enhanced enforcement protocols and addressing recent compliance actions. Victoria was clearly planning to use this meeting to retroactively justify her actions and possibly expand her authority even further. That evening, after my attorney called back and began emergency legal proceedings to recover my helicopter, I sat in my study surrounded by aviation manuals and legal documents, feeling a sense of violation that was hard to articulate. It was not just about the helicopter itself, though that was devastating enough. It was the sheer audacity of someone entering my property, breaking my lock, and taking something so personally significant, something I had every legal right to possess. Sleep eluded me that night as I pored over property laws and FAA regulations. Around 3 in the morning, exhausted and frustrated, I pulled out my original property deed and the HOA covenant documents, determined to find something, anything, that might give me leverage. As the first light of dawn filtered through my window, I found it. The covenant Victoria had cited referred specifically to unauthorized vehicles in backyards, but a separate section defined the HOA's jurisdiction as extending only to the physical property and structures, not to airspace. While they could regulate what sat on my land, they had zero authority over the air above it. That airspace, as every pilot knows, falls under FAA jurisdiction exclusively. A plan began to form in my mind, audacious, perfectly legal, and poetically just. I called my attorney as soon as business hours began, explaining what I had discovered and outlining my intentions. After a long pause, she laughed. "It is technically legal, assuming you maintain proper altitude and safety protocols. But are you sure this is the hill you want to die on?" "They stole my helicopter," I replied simply. "This is not just about the machine, it is about principle." With my attorney's reluctant blessing, I began putting my plan into motion. First, I contacted several former military colleagues who now worked in civilian aviation sectors. Through their intervention, I arranged for a temporary release of my helicopter for mandatory safety inspection and flight testing, as required by FAA regulations. This would require posting a substantial bond, but it would get my aircraft back in the air where it belonged. Next, I located a specialized equipment supplier who provided helicopter-mounted buckets typically used for aerial firefighting. With a few modifications, such a bucket could be adapted for my specific purposes. I arranged for expedited delivery and installation. The final piece came courtesy of Eduardo, whose family owned a small farm outside town. "You need aged manure?" he asked when I called, trying to keep the amusement from his voice. "How much are we talking about?" "Enough to make a statement," I replied, "and the more aromatic, the better." Eduardo chuckled. "My uncle has been composting stable waste all summer in this heat. The smell is legendary. Consider it a donation to the cause." The next 48 hours were a blur of activity. I paid the exorbitant impound fees under protest, with my attorney documenting everything for our lawsuit. The helicopter was transported to a private airfield where the bucket attachment was installed and tested. Eduardo delivered 3 50-gallon drums of what he described as weapons-grade manure, a description that proved horrifyingly accurate when we unsealed one drum for inspection. The stench was so powerful that the mechanics insisted on wearing respirators during the loading process. By Wednesday afternoon, everything was ready. From my vantage point at the airfield, I completed my pre-flight checks with methodical precision, the weight distribution calculations accounting for my unusual payload. The specialized bucket hung beneath my helicopter, filled with Eduardo's uncle's finest aged compost. I checked the weather conditions one final time: clear skies, light wind from the northwest, perfect visibility. The HOA meeting was scheduled to begin at 7:00 p.m. My timing would need to be exact. At precisely 6:45 p.m., I lifted off from the airfield, the helicopter responding perfectly to my controls despite its unusual load. I climbed to 2,000 feet, well above the minimum legal altitude for populated areas, and set course for Oak Ridge Estates. As I approached the neighborhood, I could see cars filling the clubhouse parking lot. Victoria's emergency meeting had drawn quite a crowd. I circled once at altitude, confirming the layout. The clubhouse featured a large central skylight, a detail I had always appreciated during daytime events for the natural illumination it provided. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. I positioned myself upwind of the building, calculating the drop trajectory based on the light breeze. Years of military precision drops had prepared me for this moment. Through my headset, I could hear the air traffic controller from the regional airport. November 472 Lima Papa, be advised we are showing you circling over a residential area. Do you require assistance? Negative, Tower, I responded professionally. Just conducting a brief authorized inspection flight over my own property. Will be departing the area shortly. Roger that, 72 Lima Papa. Maintain your altitude and advise when you are proceeding to your destination. Will comply, Tower, thank you. Below, I could see movement through the clubhouse windows. The meeting appeared to be in full swing, with Victoria standing at the podium, gesturing emphatically. I imagined her explaining how removing my helicopter was necessary for community standards, perhaps even using this meeting to push through more draconian enforcement powers. I maneuvered into position, directly above the skylight at the legally required minimum altitude. The bucket control switch was under my right thumb. I took a deep breath, said a silent prayer that my calculations were correct, and pressed the button. The bucket tilted precisely as designed, releasing its pungent payload in a controlled cascade. Through the open skylight, the manure dropped with remarkable accuracy, splattering across the central conference table where board documents and Victoria's presentation materials were undoubtedly arranged. I caught a brief glimpse of faces turned upward in confusion before the chaos erupted. I allowed myself one victory circle of the neighborhood at proper altitude before setting course back to the airfield. The radio crackled with the controller's voice again. November 472 Lima Papa, we are receiving reports of unusual activity at your location. Please confirm status. Tower 72 Lima Papa, no issues to report. Completing scheduled flight and returning to base. All operations conducted within FAA regulations. Roger that, 72 Lima Papa. Please be advised we may have questions upon your landing. Understood, Tower. I have all flight documentation ready for inspection. As I flew back toward the airfield, a curious sense of peace settled over me. I had taken a calculated risk, but one that made a powerful statement while remaining within the boundaries of the law. Victoria had violated my property rights and stolen my aircraft. I had simply conducted a legal flight over property where I had jurisdiction, the airspace, and released natural fertilizer that happened to find its way through an open skylight. Poetic justice, delivered from above. The next 24 hours unfolded in ways I could not have anticipated. Videos of the Manure drop spread through neighborhood chat groups and social media, with carefully blurred faces and identifying information removed. Local news picked up the story with headlines like HOA dispute reaches new heights and fertilizer falls on controversial board meeting. I maintained a dignified silence when reporters called, referring them to my attorney. Victoria, predictably, was incandescent with rage. She threatened lawsuits, criminal charges, and permanent expulsion from the community. She appeared at my door the morning after, accompanied by 2 police officers, demanding my arrest for assault with a biological substance and vandalism of community property. The officers, to their credit, maintained professional composure as they listened to her increasingly hyperbolic accusations. When she finally paused for breath, the senior officer turned to me. "Sir, would you care to provide your version of events?" "I conducted a fully licensed and legal flight in my registered aircraft," I replied calmly. "I maintained proper altitude at all times, as air traffic control records will confirm. If some organic fertilizer happened to fall through an open skylight during my legal transit of airspace that falls under FAA jurisdiction rather than HOA control, that would be an unfortunate coincidence." The younger officer coughed in what sounded suspiciously like an attempt to cover a laugh. The senior officer maintained his professional demeanor. "Ms. Harrington, unless you have evidence that Colonel Peterson intentionally targeted the clubhouse or flew below legal altitude, this appears to be a civil matter." The irony of having my own words about civil matters echoed back was not lost on me. Victoria sputtered with indignation, but could produce no such evidence. The officers departed with a warning to both of us about escalating community disputes. That afternoon, my attorney called with unexpected news. "The HOA's attorney reached out," she said, a note of satisfaction in her voice. "They want to discuss settlement terms." "Settlement?" I asked, surprised by this sudden change of direction. "It seems several board members, including Dennis and Meredith, have expressed concern about personal liability in the helicopter removal. Victoria apparently acted without a formal board vote, which violates their own bylaws. And your documentation about FAA jurisdiction is rock solid. Add to that the disclosure that just came to light about Victoria's ownership stake in the towing company, which represents a massive conflict of interest, and they are in a very weak position." 3 days later, I sat across from the HOA's attorney in a conference room downtown. Victoria was conspicuously absent, though Dennis and Meredith represented the board. The settlement terms were more favorable than I could have hoped. Full reimbursement for all towing and storage fees, payment for damages to my property, a formal amendment to the HOA covenants explicitly permitting my helicopter, and a written apology. In return, I would agree not to pursue further legal action against the board collectively, or its members individually. "And Victoria?" I asked, noticing her name was not mentioned in the agreement. Dennis cleared his throat. "Ms. Harrington has tendered her resignation from the board, effective immediately. She felt it was the appropriate course of action under the circumstances." I nodded, maintaining a neutral expression despite my inner satisfaction. "I trust there will be no further misinterpretations of the covenants or selective enforcement. The board is committed to transparency and consistency going forward," Meredith assured me. "This situation has been educational for all of us about the limits of HOA authority." Upon my return home, I found a small group of neighbors waiting. Frank stepped forward as I exited my car. "How did it go?" he asked. I smiled for what felt like the first time in weeks. Very well. The helicopter stays, all damages will be covered, and Victoria is out. A cheer went up from the gathered neighbors. Linda handed me a gift bag, a small token of our appreciation for standing up to her. Many of us wanted to, but were afraid of becoming targets. Inside the bag was a model helicopter with a tiny bucket attached to its underside. I laughed despite myself. I appreciate the support, but I hope we can all move forward now as a community. Eduardo grinned. Oh, we will. Dennis asked me to run for the board in the special election next month. I think a few of us who understand the difference between reasonable standards and power trips should get involved. In the days that followed, my helicopter was returned to its proper place in my backyard. The gate was repaired, stronger than before. Neighbors would stop by, sometimes bringing cookies or offering help with yard work, but mostly just to chat and share their own Victoria stories that had previously gone untold out of fear of retaliation. 1 year later, our community has transformed. The new board, led by Meredith with Eduardo as vice president, focuses on enhancing the neighborhood rather than policing it. Community events have increased, with an emphasis on bringing residents together rather than driving them apart. The bylaws have been revised for clarity, with ambiguous language removed to prevent future misinterpretation. Victoria moved away shortly after her resignation, reportedly to a high-rise condominium with strict, no modifications policies, perhaps the perfect environment for someone with her particular temperament. My helicopter remains in my backyard, now specifically protected by our updated covenants. I still offer aerial photography for special events, and have even established an annual charity fundraiser where I provide helicopter rides, with proceeds benefiting veterans organizations. Perhaps the most telling change is the community barbecue now held each summer, which playfully commemorates what has come to be known as the Manure incident, with chocolate-themed desserts. The first year, I worried the event might seem mean-spirited, but it has evolved into a celebration of community resilience and a reminder that sometimes standing up to petty tyranny requires creativity and courage. As for me, I find peace each morning when I step onto my back porch with my coffee and gaze at my helicopter gleaming in the sunrise. It represents not just my military service or my retirement freedom, but a principle worth defending, the principle that rules should serve communities, not subjugate them. That afternoon, when I flew over the clubhouse with my unusual payload, I was making more than a dramatic statement. I was demonstrating that even the most powerful authority has limits, and that sometimes the most effective response to absurdity is a carefully planned, legally sound, and dramatically satisfying counteraction. In our quiet community, where property values continue to rise and neighbors actually know each other's names, we have found a balance between standards and freedom. And if ever another Victoria arrives with dreams of iron-fisted rule, well, there is always more manure at Eduardo's uncle's farm.